Before dawn, on the 12th of July 1943, on the southern face of the Kursk salient near the village of WWII-TALES, a damp wind pushed low mist across fields already churned by days of fighting. The ground squelched under every bootstep as crews from 3rd Panzer Division huddled beside their Panthers and Panzer IVs, the engines idling in steady, metallic throbs that mingled with the sour smell of wet earth, diesel and cordite. A few kilometers east, pale flashes flickered through the haze, Soviet guns probing in irregular pulses, their thunder rolling in long, tired echoes. Yet the Germans that morning were not staring at the artillery. They were staring at the horizon. Through binoculars, officers watched lines of T-34-76s climbing the gentle ridges, one formation after another, their silhouettes multiplying in a way that unsettled even veterans of 1941. Many had fought at Smolensk or Kharkov and believed they understood Soviet patterns. The Red Army attacked hard, lost heavily, paused, rebuilt. But what they saw now did not match any of those cycles. Companies destroyed the previous afternoon, confirmed kills marked on turret walls seemed to have been replaced overnight. A logistics officer muttered that Soviet plants beyond the Urals were turning out more than 1,000 T-34s a month, a figure dismissed as fantasy until this moment when the battlefield itself appeared to give it shape. As the sun pushed a dull red disk through drifting smoke, German crews felt a shift they would later struggle to explain. The fight no longer seemed decided by gunnery or maneuver, but by a deeper rhythm of production that Germany could not keep pace with. That realization forms the first thread in understanding how the industrial contest behind the front grew into the true engine of the war, one whose origins lie months before Kursk, in decisions that shaped every tank rolling toward this field. The imbalance that German crews sensed at Kursk had begun long before the July smoke settled over the Prokhorovka fields. Its origins stretched back to June 1941. When the opening of Operation Barbarossa unleashed battles so vast and so fluid that armored vehicles disappeared by the hundreds each day. In the first weeks, entire Soviet mechanized corps collapsed under the speed of German penetrations, leaving behind burned-out hulks or tanks abandoned for lack of fuel and spare parts. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of Soviet machines lost in Mir Daziet. Even within this catastrophe lay the first hints of a strategic pivot. As the panzers neared Moscow in the autumn rains, Soviet leaders understood that the war could not be won by matching Germany tank for tank in tactical finesse. Victory would depend instead on building an armored force able to replace losses faster than the Wehrmacht could create them. A conclusion born directly from the scale of destruction unfolding across the western U.S. That decision reshaped the geography of an entire nation. Between July and December 1941, more than 1,500 factories were stripped of machinery, loaded onto railcars, and moved eastward beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. Among them were crucial tank producers, the Kharkov Locomotive Works, the Leningrad Kirov plant, and dozens of smaller facilities feeding them with engines, optics, transmissions, and armor plate. The evacuation created months of disarray, improvised workshops under open skies, shortages of tools, assembly lines built from mismatched equipment, but the intent never wavered. By spring 1942, these transplanted plants resumed production. With a new guiding principle, prioritize quantity, ruggedness, and speed of assembly over refinement. German commanders and Army Group Center noticed the consequences by mid-1942, reporting that Soviet armored units seemed able to regenerate after battles that should have broken them. To intelligence officers, this suggested that the Soviet Union was no longer fighting a campaign, it was preparing for an industrial war, and that shift would soon crystallize around a single machine that embodied this strategy more clearly than any other, the T-34. The vast numbers of T-34s appearing on the Eastern Front were not simply the result of political will or relocated factories. They were the product of a machine designed, from its earliest conception, to be built in volume. The T-34 of 1939 had introduced sloped armor, a Christie suspension, and wide tracks that allowed it to move confidently across the soft soils of the Western USSR. Yet these battlefield advantages concealed an equally important truth. The tank's architecture lent itself to rapid, uncomplicated assembly. When the Soviet evacuation eastward forced a redesign of industrial practice, the T-34 became the perfect chassis for an emerging doctrine of quantity over refinement. By 1942, the T-3476 had evolved into a platform whose components were deliberately simplified. Holes were welded along broad seams rather than riveted, eliminating the need for skilled metalworkers and saving hours of delicate labor. Factories standardized parts across production batches, turning once varied fittings into interchangeable units that could be bolted or welded into place without hand fitting. The diesel V2 engine, originally one of the most complex elements, benefited from revised casting techniques that allowed its key components to be produced in large, repeatable runs. All of this meant that once parts arrived at assembly halls, the rest of the process became astonishingly fast. Plants such as STZ in Stalingrad and Eurovagon-Z in Nizhny Tagil adopted conveyor-style workflows that resembled automotive lines more than traditional tank workshops. What had once taken weeks could now be completed in mere hours, with tanks rolling off lines at a tempo that startled even Soviet planners. German production, by contrast, remained rooted in craft machining, precise, meticulous, and slow. A Panzer IV demanded roughly twice the labor hours of a T-34, while the new Panther, despite its formidable armor and gun, required far more. German technical teams inspecting captured Soviet tanks in 1942 noted the crude optics, rough welds, and simple finish, but what unsettled them was how these imperfections served a deeper goal. They made the tank extraordinarily easy to build. By early 1943, monthly T-34 output pushed past 1,000 units, enabling losses to be absorbed in a way no German unit could replicate. This technical foundation would soon reshape every battlefield where German panzers attempted to halt the widening flow of Soviet armor. The first unmistakable proof that the Soviet Union had entered an industrial phase of warfare appeared during the long, grinding struggle for Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943. As the Sixth Army pushed into the northern districts of the city, German infantry advancing through the shattered factories and skeletal apartment blocks observed something that felt impossible. T-34s rolling straight out of the tractor plant and into the fighting. The image became a fixation in frontline reports. Crews swore they were facing tanks built only hours earlier. Their paint still fresh, their weld seams bright under the dust. Although these vehicles represented only a small share of overall Soviet output, the psychological effect on the German line was profound. Every destroyed T-34 seemed to be replaced the next morning, as if the ruins themselves were producing armor at will. North of the city, where the approaches along the Volga bends saw daily armored clashes, German battalions noted an unsettling rhythm. Soviet units that had taken heavy losses on one day returned the next with what appeared to be full complements of tanks. These observations reached Army Group headquarters in the autumn, where analysts struggled to reconcile them with earlier estimates of Soviet strength. The discrepancy grew sharper in November 1942, when Operation Uranus encircled the Sixth Army. The 5th Tank Army and 4th Mechanized Corps entered the offensive with armored numbers higher than German staff officers thought possible after months of attrition, even without knowing precise production figures. German intelligence began warning that Soviet reserves were expanding despite continuous combat trend that contradicted every pre-war assumption about Soviet industrial capacity. Stalingrad, therefore, became the first battlefield where industrial resilience revealed itself not as theory but as immediate, tactical reality. And it was only a precursor to what German panzer units would confront the following summer, when the full weight of Soviet output made its presence unmistakable at Kursk. In the weeks after the surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943, German intelligence analysts began piecing together a picture far more alarming than anything anticipated at the start of the war. From Ed Hirosta intelligence branch responsible for assessing Soviet capabilities compiled new estimates based on frontline reports, prisoner interrogations, and intercepted signals. What emerged in March 1943 contradicted every expectation formed during Barbarossa. Despite the confirmed destruction of more than 15,000 Soviet tanks since June 1941, Soviet operational reserves were not contracting, they were expanding. The conclusion struck senior officers at OKH as almost paradoxical, yet the pattern repeated across multiple sectors of the front. Field commanders, in Army Group South, provided some of the most telling observations. Mechanized brigades they had battered during winter counterattacks reappeared weeks later with what seemed like full complements of T-34s. Some regiments reported Soviet formations replacing dozens of tanks within a single week, a tempo that bore no resemblance to the replenishment cycles of 1941 or early 1942. Analysts traced this acceleration to the final maturation of the industrial network rebuilt east of the Urals. Plants in Nizhny Tagil and Sverdlovsk had reached sustained, synchronized production by early 1943. Enabling a continuous flow of armored vehicles, even as the Red Army fought on multiple fronts. German officers were especially unsettled by estimates suggesting Soviet factories might now be producing over 1,200 tanks per month. Initially dismissed as exaggeration, these figures gained credibility as unit diaries repeated the same complaint. Soviet tank losses no longer resulted in any meaningful operational weakening. Panther and Tiger crews, awaiting their own vehicles months behind schedule, sensed the imbalance growing with each delay. This perception directly shaped strategic decision-making. The need to gather more heavy armor contributed to the postponement of Operation Citadel, a decision that unintentionally granted the Soviets precious time to build even greater reserves. Those intelligence warnings formed the backdrop for the massive confrontation that would unfold at Kursk, where German crews would face the full consequence of this industrial surge. By the spring of 1943, the Soviet Union's relocated factories had not only recovered from the chaos of evacuation they had entered, a phase of output so sustained and so rhythmic that it began reshaping the strategic balance of the entire Eastern Front. At the center of this transformation stood in Nizhny Tagil, once a railcar plant. It had absorbed evacuated machinery from the Kharkov locomotive works and evolved into the largest tank factory on Earth. Its assembly halls functioned less like an armaments workshop and more like an industrial beltway, where T-34 hulls advanced through each station in predictable intervals, their completion measured in hours. Once components arrived, welders, machinists, and fitters worked in overlapping shifts under a system designed to keep metal moving without pause. Nearby, the Selyabinsk-Kirov plant, quickly nicknamed Tankograd, operated as the logistical heart of this network. It specialized in engines, transmissions, and heavy castings, supplying neighboring factories with a steady stream of standardized parts. This division of labor allowed plants across the Urals in Sverdlovsk, Omsk, and Magnitogorsk to synchronize their work with unprecedented efficiency. The rail lines feeding them, from the Trans-Siberian to the Ural junctions, carried armor plate, fuel, and spare components eastward while returning completed tanks toward the front. What made this system extraordinary was not just its machinery but its workforce. Simplified designs allowed semi-skilled laborers, including large numbers of women and teenagers, to take on critical roles. As a result, the first half of 1943 alone produced more tanks than the entire year of 1941. These reserves enabled the Red Army to rebuild shattered formations, create new tank corps, and position armored concentrations behind the expected German axes of attack. German logistical officers monitoring railway movements toward Belgorod and Orel in April and May grew increasingly concerned. Trains loaded with T-34s arrived faster than intelligence summaries could update their estimates, giving the impression of an opponent whose armored strength regenerated almost instantly. That industrial tempo set the stage for July 1943, when the full weight of Soviet production would be felt at Kursk in a way no German division could ignore. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 became the moment when German expectations, shaped by 2 years of armored dominance, finally broke under the weight of industrial reality. When Operation Citadel opened on the 5th of July, German commanders believed they had assembled a decisive striking force. Panthers from the 51st and 52nd Panzer Battalions, Tigers of Schwer Panzer Adelung, and seasoned Panzer IV regiments drawn from some of the most experienced divisions on the Eastern Front. Their plan hinged on the principle that concentrated armored thrusts, applied with precision, would rupture the Soviet defenses before the Red Army could react with meaningful reserves. But within hours of the first engagements south of Belgorod, that assumption began to crack. That as German spearheads pushed through the defensive belts, panzer crews reported an unsettling pattern. T-34s destroyed in the morning seemed replaced by the afternoon. Counterattacks that should have exhausted Soviet reserves appeared again the next day with equal or greater strength. Reports from 1st Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army described armored concentrations far larger than German intelligence had predicted, a mismatch that grew sharper with each passing day. The shock deepened on the 12th of July at Prokhorovka, where the 2 SS Panzer Corps recorded some of the most intense close-range fighting of the war. Officers expected a weakened enemy after the attrition of the previous days, but instead saw entire formations of T-34s advancing in dense waves, many of them drawn from stockpiles built during the spring production surge in the Urals. The realization cut through German ranks with clarity. Tactical skill could destroy Soviet tanks, but not fast enough to influence the wider battle. Attrition, once an ally of the Wehrmacht, now favored the Red Army, even as German gunners inflicted heavy losses. They could not diminish the momentum of an enemy whose industrial base replenished armor overnight. This confrontation between battlefield effectiveness and industrial capacity marked a psychological turning point that would soon shape how German soldiers understood the war's direction beyond Kursk. By mid-July 1943, as the battle for the Kursk salient dragged into its second week, a different kind of fatigue began to spread through German frontline units, one not caused by exhaustion or casualties but by a dawning sense that the Soviet Union's armored strength was no longer something that could be meaningfully reduced. Panzer crews, who had spent days firing, maneuvering, and pulling back to regroup, noticed an unsettling rhythm. The same Soviet brigades they had mauled the previous afternoon seemed to return at dawn with full complements of vehicles. Letters later recovered from crewmen described a creeping futility, the realization that each destroyed T-34 was instantly replaced by another drawn from a reservoir of reserves deeper than anything the Wehrmacht could match. Veteran officers, some of whom had fought since the first months of Barbarossa, felt the shift most sharply. In 1941 and 1942, Soviet armored losses had translated into quieter sectors and weaker camps. But at Kursk, the opposite now seemed true. Even after suffering devastating casualties in the defensive belts or during the clashes around Prokhorovka, Soviet formations returned to the fight with a steadiness that suggested not resilience alone, but a production capacity functioning behind them at full force. This impression of inexhaustibility carried into the infantry lines as well, where soldiers watched fresh columns of T-34s clatter along dusty tracks toward the front despite days of unbroken combat. The psychological impact was cumulative. Morale dipped, caution increased, and operational initiative began to erode. Units were less willing to gamble on higher-risk assaults when it seemed clear that any tactical victory would be blunted by the arrival of yet another Soviet armored wave. By the middle of the month, the question nagging German battalion staffs was no longer whether they could win a particular engagement, but whether winning even mattered, in a battle where the enemy's numbers regenerated almost instantly. That shift in mindset framed the tactical and operational recalibrations Germany attempted next, as it searched for ways to confront an enemy whose industrial engine was now unmistakably dominant. In the aftermath of Operation Citadel's failure in mid-July 1943, a sobering recognition settled over the upper levels of German command. The war in the East had shifted from a contest of maneuver to a confrontation defined overwhelmingly by industrial capacity. The armored thrusts that had once carved open the Soviet lines in 1941 and 1942 no longer produced decisive results. Instead, every advanced cost tanks Germany could not replace, while the Red Army absorbed losses and returned with newly formed units. Built from a production base that seemed to expand each month, the disparity was visible in the organization charts of German panzer divisions, many of which entered the summer with fewer than half their authorized vehicles, and ended it with even less. As the Soviets launched their own offensives of Kutuzov against Orel and Operation Rumyantsov toward Kharkova, implications of this imbalance became unavoidable. German commanders and army groups center and south reported that Soviet armored spearheads continued to press forward even after suffering casualties that would have shattered earlier formations. Where a division might once have expected its enemy to pause after major losses, the Red Army now followed one assault with another, drawing on reserves built in the Urals and Kazakhstan during the spring surge. These sequential operations prevented the Wehrmacht from reconstituting its defenses, forcing withdrawals first from the Oral salient and later toward the Dnieper River. Strategically, the meaning was unmistakable. The Eastern Front had become a war of attrition on a scale Germany could not sustain. Panthers and Tigers, formidable as they were, could not be produced quickly enough to offset battlefield losses, whereas the Red Army continuously fielded new brigades, equipped with fresh batches of T-34s. By the autumn of 1943, field reports reflected a growing consensus. Germany was fighting an opponent whose industrial engine gave it the ability to dictate the tempo of the war. That realization leads naturally to the next question: how each side attempted to adapt to this imbalance in the months that followed. Even as Soviet industry surged to its peak in late 1943, the mass production approach that fueled the Red Army's armored strength came with limitations that shaped how those tanks fought. The T-34-76, the backbone of Soviet armored forces, remained far from an ideal battlefield machine. Its two-man turret placed both command and gunnery duties on a single crewman, reducing situational awareness at the very moments when rapid decisions mattered most. Visibility was restricted by crude periscopes, ergonomics were cramped, and mechanical issues remained frequent, especially in units pushed through long marches before battle. Many crews received only minimal training, sometimes just days or weeks, a constraint that often translated into high early losses even when numerical advantages were significant. Soviet doctrine adapted to these weaknesses by embracing the strengths their industrial system provided: mass, coordination, and relentless pressure. Tank assaults were designed to strike in depth, supported closely by infantry, artillery, and engineers, with the understanding that losses could be absorbed and momentum maintained through sheer volume. The Red Army did not expect every tank to survive. It expected enough to reach the objective. German forces, recognizing the widening industrial gap, developed their own adaptations. Anti-tank defenses thickened across the front as the Pak-40 and later Panzerfaust appeared in increasing numbers. Heavier armor entered service in the form of the Panther and Tiger, machines capable of dominating at long range but hampered by complex engineering, high maintenance demands, and production numbers too low to alter the strategic equation. German factories, constrained by material shortages and the growing impact of Allied bombing, could not simplify their designs fast enough to match Soviet volume. The result was a battlefield defined by the tension between quality and quantity. With German units increasingly fighting, delaying actions rather than sustained offensives, These contrasting adaptations set the stage for the post-war reassessment of armored warfare, where the influence of mass production would come into even sharper focus. When the war ended in 1945, military theorists and analysts across the world turned to the Eastern Front to understand how an armored campaign of unprecedented scale had been decided. What emerged from these studies was a consensus that reached far beyond any single battle. The determining factor in the armored war had been industrial capacity, not technological sophistication alone. The Soviet Union's production of more than 57,000 T-34s demonstrated that a tank engineered for mass manufacture could influence the strategic tempo of a conflict more deeply than exquisitely built machines produced in limited numbers. The T-34's impact, post-war analysts concluded, lay not just in its sloped armor or reliable diesel engine, but in the logistical ecosystem that sustained it. Factories synchronized across thousands of kilometers, rail networks adapted to deliver parts and completed vehicles, and a doctrine built around exploiting numerical strength. German officers writing after the war for the U.S. Army's Operational Research Office reinforced this interpretation. Many argued that their wartime experience had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Armies could be defeated not simply by better tactics or superior technology, but by the speed at which an opponent could replace what was lost. The lessons did not remain theoretical. Nations such as the United States, Britain, and France incorporated elements of Soviet production philosophy into their post-war designs, emphasizing standardized components, simplified hull forms, and manufacturing scalability. These ideas crystallized most visibly in the Cold War as vehicles like the T-54, 55th direct descendants of T-34. Mass production principles became the most widely produced tanks in history. For many German veterans who had stood on the fields near Belgorod, Kursk became the moment that revealed this shift in warfare. It was there that crews realized armor thickness and gunpowder mattered, lest if the enemy could rebuild his armored strength overnight. That recognition leads naturally back to the final reflections of this story, where battlefield impressions and industrial reality converged into a single, decisive lesson. As evening settled over the fields near Prokhorovka on the 12th of July 1943, the haze of dust and smoke thinned just enough for German crews to see what lay beyond the wrecks scattered across the steppe. Recovery teams from the Red Army were already at work, dragging disabled T-34s toward the rear, even as fresh machines rolled forward to occupy the same ground. It was a scene that struck many Panzer officers more deeply than the day's close-range fighting. Even the heaviest German tanks, the Tigers and Panthers that had been expected to shape the course of the battle, could not alter the equation now unfolding before their eyes. The Soviets were replacing armor faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy it, and no amount of tactical skill could reverse a process driven by factories hundreds of kilometers away. In the years after the war, German veterans rarely described this moment in dramatic terms. Instead, their memoirs carried a tone of subdued clarity. Kursk had revealed that the Eastern Front had become a struggle, decided not by breakthrough maneuvers but by production capacity. Once Soviet industry reached full tempo in the Urals, the outcome had begun to tilt irreversibly. For the men who stood on that battlefield, watching new T-34s appear against the dimming horizon, the realization was unmistakably a recognition that the conflict's decisive front ran through assembly halls, not only through trenches and tank tracks. Returning to that dawn image that opened the story, where German crews confronted an armored force that seemed to renew itself as quickly as it was struck down, brings the narrative full circle. The central truth endures. The war was shaped as much by industrial power as by battlefield courage.